Good day, and welcome to Nirmal Ransom's weekly wraps. I'm Vav Govender. And what we're going to do this week a little different. We're going to do two deep dives, one into inflation and one into the AI chip ecosystem. So, starting with inflation. Inflation this week from the US came in higher than expected. Now, it's still a fall from the previous period, but it was higher than expected, 3.1%. Expectations were for 2.9%. Now, this comes after we saw some really good economic numbers from the US, including some job numbers that were spectacularly good. We're talking over 100,000 better than expected jobs this time around, and over 100,000 better than expected jobs in the revision. So the last period, they looked back at it and said, no, we were wrong. There's over 100,000 jobs that were created there that we didn't even see. And this period, there's more than 100,000 jobs than we expected to be created. So we're talking a couple hundred, 300,000 jobs or so were more away in the US economy over the last couple of periods than had been anticipated. So a very strong economy. So inflation higher than expected, 3.1, they expected 2.9, and jobs better than expected. The economy is doing very well. Now, why is this an issue? Because this means the Central Reserve, the US government, the Central Reserve of the US Federal Reserve, is basically the Central Bank of the US Federal Reserve, is seeing that there is no justification at the moment to cut interest rates as quickly as they had been hoping. Okay, and that's very important for markets because there's only about two things that affect markets like historically consistently. One is taxation levels, and the second thing is interest rates. And taxation levels, of course, come in chunky, like tax reforms and so on, and are much less variable over time. But interest rates are variable, and we know for a fact that over time, interest rates go up, market returns go down, interest rates go down, market returns go up. The market right now is expecting rate cuts by the middle of the year. And in fact, at one point in time, a few months ago, there was like a 99.9% chance of a rate cut or 99.8% chance of a rate cut by, the middle of the year. Right now, it's coming closer to about, say, 80% for June, which is, a 20% chance that it's not going to happen from about 0.2 to a 20% chance of it not happening, a big differential. Now, the question is, if the central bank wants to cut, why can't it just cut? Why does it have to look at this inflation number that's coming down, and why does it have to look at this unemployment rate, etc.? Well, you would understand how central banks think of the economy, how they operate, and what they are basically out there trying to do. The way a central bank operates in the modern system is using what's called inflation targeting. They go after inflation expectations, how the market, how the economy believes inflation is going to develop over the next couple of years, and they try and change that. The way it works is a crude example. Imagine you are walking into a bar. Okay, and somebody comes and bumps up into you, disrespects you in some way. The idea that what the central banks would do is this: they would beat that person up, irrespective of the cost to you. You just make sure that the person that bumped into you pays a huge price for bumping into you. Okay, you overreact to it effectively. That overreaction, what it does is that nobody else is going to bump into you after that. Why? Because they've just seen you beat up somebody for just bumping into you. Okay, the threat of what you've done basically means that you don't have to use violence again in the future. So the fact that you use too much violence for the bump right now means that you won't have to use violence in the future because people now believe your threat. That's the idea. The same thing with the central bank. The way the central bank operates is when inflation goes beyond that target, they do whatever it takes to bring inflation back to the target. Okay, so it goes from 2 to 3% or 5% or whatever. You do whatever it takes to get back to 2%, even if it causes unemployment, even if it causes a recession. You are effectively overreacting. You're basically, hurting your economy. You're hurting basically employment levels. I think there's a stat out there that 1% increase in unemployment in the US kills 40,000 people. It was mentioned in the movie, the Michael Lewis movie. But that is something they do because they believe that by doing it like that, what happens thereafter is that whenever inflation goes up to 2.5 to 3%, the market stops believing that it's going to stay at 2.5 to 3%, and they have to do less to bring it down back to 2%. They have to use less violence, in other words, or high interest rates to control inflation in the future by overreacting whenever inflation gets out of the range initially. Now, this goes back all the way to a guy called Paul Volcker back in the late 70s, early 80s. In the US, he was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, gigantic man, like 2 meters tall, But he's like a legend, a giant also in terms of central banks out there. He's, all central bankers, he's like the hero of central bankers effectively. He basically saw a US economy with inflation that was too high. He came in and he raised interest rates, not just once, but twice, and he raised them like almost 20% one time. He caused a recession, he caused massive increase in unemployment. But by doing that, what he did was he prevented inflation getting out of control in the US for over 40 years thereafter. And the US has enjoyed low inflation for 40 years, and some believe this is Paul Volcker's doing because of what he did around the early 80s, late 70s. That is the belief system around central bankers. So in South Africa, our target range is 3 to 6%. In the US, the target is 2%. So even though the inflation rate fell from just over 3% to 3.1%, they expected 2.9%, the Federal Reserve can't really start dropping interest rates until it is very certain that it's going to hit its 2% target. Because if it doesn't basically drop interest rates, doesn't hit the 2% target and starts dropping interest rates, and the target is not hit again, it kind of damages the credibility. And to understand why this is important, you have to understand how the credibility and how the system of inflation works. Inflation is the increase in prices over time. Do you ever wonder why inflation increases like by 3 or 4% in South Africa every single year? Or why it increases by 2% in the US every single year? You don't see the price of oil going up by 2%. You don't see the price of petrol going up by 2% every year. You don't see the price of gold going up by 2% every year, or any kind of commodity constantly increasing by the same amount every year. What's driving the steady increase in inflation? The answer is wages. Wages are the thing that turns supply shocks, like a sharp increase in prices, into a long-term increase in prices. Why? Because if there's an increase in prices, cost of living, people ask for more wages, they ask for an increase in the salary, and that basically doesn't go away. The price of petrol may go from 120 down to 80. Your wage is not going to go from basically 1,000 down to 800, whatever it may be. That's how wages work. They only ratchet up, they don't go down. And if you're looking at how basically short-term supply shocks turn into long-term inflation, it generally is through the wage bill. Okay. Now, how do people set wages? Now, imagine your boss comes and offers you an increase of 10% next year. Is that a good or bad increase? Now, let's just say you think next year the inflation rate is going to be 100%. That means your cost of living is going to double. And your boss is offering you 10%. Are you going to be happy with that? No. Okay. You'll effectively be dropping down dramatically in terms of living standards because you won't have enough money to spend like you spent this year. If on the other hand, you believe that the inflation rate next year is going to be 0, that means all the prices are going to stay the same, that 10% increase is nice. It's, we're going to have 10% more money next year, 10% more stuff can be bought because prices are going to stay the same. So your belief in the inflation expectations for next year are going to determine how much wages you're going to ask for. Now, if you look at a place like Zimbabwe, where the central bank lost control of inflation expectations, what happened was people kept on asking for higher and higher wages. Firms asked for higher prices to pay for their goods and services. Workers asked for higher wages to pay for their labor. And they never basically believed that inflation was going to come down, and therefore they kept on asking for increasing the higher amounts. And the central bank lost control of pricing. And, you know what happened there. You saw the $1 trillion notes and so on in Zimbabwe. In the US, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, has a lot more credibility. The market believes them. And so even when inflation was 8-9%, at the worst in the last couple of years, when you look forward 10 years, people were believing it was going to be much closer to 2% than to the current inflation rate. Why? Because they believed the Central Reserve was going to step in and control it. And that is the power of inflation targeting. The fact that the people believed the Central Reserve was going to be controlling it meant that they were not going and basically assuming that next year was also going to be 8% and asking for an 8% wage increase to match that. Had that been the case, then inflation would be much more difficult to basically combat in the US. So the Federal Reserve in the US has to maintain its inflation targeting discipline, basically making sure that inflation is down before it starts cutting interest rates, even if there was a problem with the economy, even if there was a problem with unemployment, because that kind of maintains the credibility. It maintains the threat in the market that no matter what happens, we're going to make sure inflation comes down. And that is how that works. Now, the fact that we are seeing unemployment very low, we are seeing higher than expected job numbers, and we are seeing inflation higher than expected, makes it much more difficult for the Federal Reserve to start cutting interest rates as soon as people are believing. And if they're not cutting interest rates as soon as people are believing, Like I said before, interest rates linked to the market is probably a little too high versus what it probably should be given what the Fed is likely to do. Okay, that's inflation. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the chip sector. Now, you guys know I run an AI portfolio. And I've been quite vocal about how I believe AI is the next big thing, like mobile phones or the internet. And in fact, if the experts start to believe it's bigger than the internet and it's bigger than phones, it's bigger than pretty much anything that you've experienced in your lifetime, unless you're old enough to experience the emergence of electricity. And maybe there's a couple of you there listening to me in the hundreds, but I don't think there's many of you. There are not many people out there that have experienced something that's going to be a significant technological change as AI. Now, whenever this technological change happens, people often wonder, where do you make the money off it? Like in mobile phones, where did you make the money? In the internet, where was the money made? In electricity, where was the money made? Like electricity, it wasn't the power companies that made the money. They had made some money, but a lot of the money was made by factories that use the power to upskill it basically or improve productivity. In mobile phones, where was the money made? It wasn't made by the carriers. It's made by places like Apple and Samsung. In the internet, where was money made? It wasn't made by the people that had, the wires and whatnot. It was made by companies like, Uber, Airbnb, Facebook and Google and Amazon. That's where the money was made. Now, starting off with AI, obviously it will develop over time, and where the money is going to be made will over time change. But right now, where is the money being made in AI? And the answer is it's in the chip sector. Because to make AI, to understand the process of how it works, what you do is you take a lot of data, put it with a hell of a lot of computing power. And we're talking right now billions of dollars of computing power. We're talking, virtually the entire internet worth of data, or something almost like the internet worth of data. Data measured in not gigabytes or terabytes, but they go petabytes, huge amounts of data. Feed it through this massively expensive system, and you come out at the end of it with a thing that's like a huge amount of weights. That is your AI program, like your LLM, like your DALL-Es or your Geminis or your Chat GPTs, etc. That's how it works. Now the data is in dispute as to who owns it. I mean, people are using stuff from the New York Times, people are using stuff from Twitter, people are using stuff from Google. Who knows where the data basically is owned? But the chips that are used to make it, that's definitely on. It's a physical product, and people need to buy it and own it and control it. And so what we've seen over the last year or so is a huge uptick in the valuation of chip companies. NVIDIA, ARM, AMD. And ARM recently, I don't know if you guys saw, went up like 50, 60% in a day. Okay, why? It's because it was proven in like the latest earnings that they are actually also part of the AI ecosystem, and people were kind of doubting that. NVIDIA is the leading AI ecosystem, and right now, as I speak to you, it's one of the most valuable companies in the world. It's more valuable than Google. It's more valuable than Amazon. It's like Microsoft and Apple ahead of it, basically. So we're talking about one of the most valuable companies in the world based on chips, and it wasn't anywhere near this 2-3 years ago. And now the next thing is, how are these chips made? Now the weird thing is that NVIDIA doesn't have a monopoly on chips. It has a technology that it uses, but it doesn't have a monopoly. It has design. It doesn't even own the factories to make the chips. It's made by a company in Taiwan. And the same thing with ARM, and the same thing with all these other places here. The actual monopoly in chips doesn't occur with the companies that are making the most money at the moment. It occurs further up the supply stream. It occurs in a company called ASML. ASML stands for Advanced Semiconductor Material Lithography. Lithography means light etching, etching with light. Okay. Now, to understand how the stuff is made, how computer chips are made, what you do is you need to etch, on like the silicon wafers, really little tiny little lines, and the only way to do it is to use really, really high powered kind of or really high frequency, light. We're talking ultraviolet light. Why? Because we're at a point, and this is quite amazing if you had to think about it, where the wavelength of normal light, the stuff that normal light can actually get down to, in terms of being able to actually discriminate against, is not small enough for the current state of computer chips. So we have to use ultraviolet, even tinier light waves, basically to cut into these silicon wafers. And I would say to you that in terms of all the things that human civilization is currently developed, I would argue quite convincingly that the one aspect of technology that we have developed to the furthest end, compared to any other, is our manufacturing of computer chips. I think that the amount of technology, the fact that we are bumping against the actual laws of physics here, is what's is incredible about it. In almost nothing else are we bumping against the laws of physics. No power station is hitting the highest possible temperature allowed by physics. No car has the strongest material allowed by physics. But in terms of computer chips, we are literally getting to the point at which we are making the smallest possible etchings on these things that are allowed by the physics that we know about. Okay, we're getting close to that. Okay, so that is where we are in terms of the chips. Very, very high end technology. And there's one company called ASML that kind of makes the machines that make the chips. And these machines are incredibly expensive. We're talking like $500 million for like a set of machines to make like chips. There's like 4 or 5 machines like they use to make these chips. And the set of them that you require for that is like $500 million+ to make them. And they are pretty much the only company that makes the really, really high-end chips. And it's virtually impossible to copy them because they are not about patents, they're not about whatever. It's like actual practice. And you may have the recipe, but unless you're the actual cook and you know exactly how things are done and all the little kind of details about making stuff, it's going to be very difficult for you to replicate this kind of super high-end, super high, precision technology. Okay, so that is where the money is not. It should be going, but it's not going yet. So, in fact, in our AI portfolio, which I've talked to you about before, like I said, we're actually adding an ASML. It has not done as well as NVIDIA. It has not done as well as ARM or AMD or even Intel. But this is the supplier. This is the ultimate supplier. This is the true monopoly in this space. Now, the next thing to understand is people know this. People are out there trying to basically get chips and get manufacturing of chips. Why? Through a quirk of geography, the place in which chips are made, the machines are made in Europe, but the actual chips themselves, the place that you take the machines to and make the chips, is actually Taiwan. Now, for those that know anything about Taiwan, there's a big danger of China invading them in the next few years. That would be devastating to the global economy. Computer chips are like the new oil. They're essential for the way the global economy operates, and therefore having this vulnerability in China is very, very dangerous. And so now we are seeing a lot of places in the world trying to get up and try and make their own chips, either in their own countries or places near to them, like in the US, or in the US, or maybe in a place like Mexico. That is obviously going to demand one thing: more machines to make the chips. Think about it. Yeah, there was one supplier before, and you supply them with chips, chip making machines rather. ASML supplies stuff to like TSMC in Taiwan, but now the Americans want to make them at home. Maybe some European countries want to make them at home. Maybe the Indians want to make them at home. The Japanese want to make them at home. It's probably going to be more expensive to make these chips as opposed to have a single, manufacturer out there. But for the person that sells the machines that make the chips, that is very, very good news. Like I said, that's why we're adding ASML to our AI portfolio. To learn more about the AI portfolio, for those that don't know, give us a call, viv@ransos.com or info@ransos.com, and you'll find more information about the AI portfolio and how it's performed. And we actually done quite well recently. We just reached about 15% the last couple of days, and this is for a portfolio that started about 6 months ago. Okay, thanks for joining me, and I look forward to speaking to you guys again next week. Cheers.